Good day. Today is Friday, 11th April 2025, and the standoff in terms of tariffs between the United States and China continues. The United States confirmed last night that the actual tariff on Chinese goods stands at 145% of the value. And earlier today, the Chinese State Council retaliated by increasing its tariffs on American goods exported to China to 125%. I'm not going to devote much more of this program to the topic of tariffs. I said most of what I wanted to say about it yesterday. Just a few things briefly. Firstly, when we have tariffs on this scale, 145% in terms of Chinese goods exported to the United States and 125% in terms of goods exported to China, any American goods exported to China, any further increase in tariffs over and above these numbers is purely demonstrative. It can make no realistic difference. Basically, each of these countries is now conducting an economic blockade against the other. I think that is clear. President Trump yesterday made comments saying that he couldn't imagine any circumstance in which he would raise tariffs on China even further. And in its announcement of the latest tariffs that China is now imposing on the United States, the ones that have brought tariffs up to the level of 125%, China's State Council essentially said the same, that from this point on, if the United States continues to increase tariffs, China will not respond. There is no point in doing so. So there we are. We are in a situation where the two biggest economies are no longer trading with each other. At some point, I expect that they will begin discussions. In the meantime, turbulence in the financial markets continues. Yesterday, the financial markets fell. Today, they are a little more steady as I speak. The dollar, however, continues to lose value. And incidentally, we've had more comments, more reports over the course of the last few hours explaining some of the events of the last couple of days. It seems, according to American US media reports, that the sudden sell-off of treasuries, the sell-off of treasuries, which began some days ago and which put pressure on President Trump, causing him to reverse his reciprocal tariffs, to pause his reciprocal tariffs for 90 days. It seems that sell-off of treasuries was not launched by China and was not the result of panicked investors pulling their money out of treasuries. It was actually initiated by Japan, by the Japanese central bank, the biggest holder of all of US treasuries. It began a process of selling treasuries, perhaps with the intention of obliging the United States to take the step which it did, which is to pull back on its reciprocal tariffs against Japan. We are, to repeat again the point that I made yesterday, still left with 10% tariffs, basically across the board, affecting nearly all the countries that the United States trades with to any significant degree. We also have higher tariffs on products like motor vehicles and aluminium imported to the United States. These colossal tariffs against China, of course, also remain in place. And it is important to say that China is the United States, or was the United States' biggest single trade partner and biggest single supplier of finished goods. So some people have done calculations and they've decided that the United States still has overall tariffs of around 15% on all imported goods, on the value of all imported goods. The reality is that with the trade with China stopped, with consumer goods from China no longer able to access the US market, we will no doubt start to see consumer good shortages start to appear in the United States at some point over the next few weeks and months. Anyway, there we are. That's where we are. I expect and assume that at some point the United States and China will meet and will have discussions with each other and will take steps to try to bring the tariffs that each has imposed against the other down. But to repeat what I've been saying in several programs now, the world that existed before, the world of globalization, has ended. Keir Starmer might be saying it also, but that doesn't make it untrue. Incidentally, since I am on the topic of Keir Starmer, just to say that he has actually been visiting some factories and talking to a number of people about the economic situation that Britain finds itself in. He has rather astonishingly confirmed that not only has he not spoken to Donald Trump since the tariff crisis began, but apparently he's made no attempt to speak to Donald Trump, which, given the effect on the British economy, does strike me as extraordinary. But anyway, never mind. Anyway, from what I can understand, from what I'm hearing, when he does actually go to factories and places like that, he very quickly reverts to that topic, which is back as his comfort zone, which is, of course, Ukraine. I discussed this in a recent program. I expressed my incredulity at the extent of Keir Starmer's fixation with this subject. I will return to it later, further at a later point in this program, because most of this program, in fact, is going to be devoted to the topic of Ukraine and the conflict there and where the conflict is heading. Now, in order to do that, I think it's a good point, in fact, to give another brief summary of the military situation on the battlefronts. As I said in my program yesterday, General Syrsky, the military chief of the Ukrainian military, has now admitted, or rather has now confirmed, that we are indeed in the early stages of a Russian offensive. And he's made some rather interesting points. I have now managed to read the entire interview in which he made those points, though you can find an interesting and good summary of the interview provided by Simplicius the Thinker. You can find it on Simplicius's blog. Now, there's a number of things to say. Firstly, he admits that the Russians are becoming more active and that an offensive is underway. His interviewer asked him how long he thought the Russians could sustain this new offensive, and I noticed that he evaded giving an answer. He also acknowledged that the Russians have no problems with manpower. He said that their forces increase in size by around 9,000 men, 9 to 10,000 men every month. He says that at the beginning of the year, the Russian army within Ukraine numbered around 600,000. He now says that the Russian forces, the Russian army, has increased, that it is closer to 635,000, that it has actually grown significantly since January and continues to do so. Now, a number of people have done back of the envelope calculations. The Russians say that their forces are growing, that rather the number of people who are joining up the signing contracts with the Russian army every month is around 30,000, and people are deducting this 9,000 total from that figure of 30,000, and they are coming to a back of the envelope calculation that must mean that the Russians, since their forces are growing at a rate of around 9,000 a month, that must mean that their losses in any one month are around 21,000. So that out of the 30,000 who are recruited every month, 21,000 replace those who have been lost, and another 9,000 supplement and increase the total. Now, as Simplicius the Thinker correctly says, it's probably unwise to make that assumption. It's more likely the case that large numbers of men are leaving the Russian army as part of a regular churn. Simplicius the Thinker says that every month contracts, Russian soldiers who have contracts with the army leave the army and return to civilian life in some form, that this does go on. So it's difficult to make back of the envelope assumptions and make us assume that in fact the Russians are suffering losses, dead and wounded, of 21,000 a month. Simplicius the Thinker suggests that maybe losses are half that figure, 21,000 a month, in which case he guesstimates that the actual Russian losses killed in action might be 150 daily, with perhaps a further 300 irrecoverable losses as well. Who knows? I'm not going to try and make back of the envelope calculations of the same kind. Suffice to say that the numbers are increasing, and the Russian army every month in Ukraine gets bigger and bigger. By the way, I would add that, in my opinion, a very large proportion of those additional 21,000 men that we have been hearing about are being positioned in various reserve formations that are being held back inside Russia itself for all sorts of reasons. Just to say. Now, the other claim that he made, that Kursk made, is that Ukraine, by contrast, is short of men. It needs a mobilization figure of 30,000 a month in order to maintain parity with where it is. And though he didn't exactly say it, it was pretty clear that he was not getting those 30,000 men each month. In fact, a very large part of the interview is devoted to the question of the failure of mobilization in Ukraine. I say failure, the lack of mobilization in Ukraine. Well, there we are. So the Russian army gets bigger, the Ukrainian army gets smaller, the Ukrainian army struggles to replace losses, the Russian army has no difficulty replacing losses. Kursk also provided some absolutely astonishing information about Russian artillery usage. He said that at the height of Russia's offensive last year, Russia was firing 40,000 rounds of shells every day. He then said that in recent weeks, that figure had fallen to 23,000 a day, and he attributed that to Ukraine's successful destruction of certain large depots, ammunition depots deep inside Russia, specifically, and most specifically, the Toropets depot, that which the Ukrainians attacked in September 2024. He didn't actually name this depot, but it was clear that that was what he meant. And the total numbers of rounds fired by the Russians fell to 23,000. But he admits that recently the number of rounds has crept up, has increased to 27 to 28,000. Now, these are astonishing numbers. If the Russians were firing ammunition, artillery ammunition, at the rate of 40,000 a day, then that must mean that they are producing shells at the rate of roughly 14 million a year, far above any estimates that I have seen. Maybe, as Syrskyi said, this is not all Russian production. Maybe the North Koreans are supplying shells or producing the shells, and it is this which has enabled the Russians to increase production rates to these extraordinary levels. I'm not able to judge this or guess this myself. I suspect that Russia has been importing shells from North Korea, and I'm going to make a guess that this is mostly now new production churned out by North Korea's arms factories. But I don't know, and it's likely also the production of shells in Russia itself has also grown. Now, the Soviet Union during the Second World War was able to produce 100 million shells a year. That on a much smaller and far less sophisticated industrial base than the one Russia has today. But of course, that was done in conditions of total war. Russia is not in conditions of total war. Most of the civilian economy continues to function in its normal way. But I suspect that Russia does have scope, or did have scope, to increase shell production well above the 3 to 4 million a year that people were talking about at the start of last year. But 14 million a year, that does seem incredible. And it is amazing, it is astonishing that people do not talk about it. Now, let me just add a few further things. Syrskyi says that over the last couple of weeks, the firing rate of shells declined to 23,000 a day. He attributes this, as I said, to the destruction of the Russian ammunition depots, which were hit by Ukrainian drones. I'm going to suggest that there is a completely different explanation, and that is that the tempo of military operations slowed in February, in February and March, and was no longer at that very, very high rate that it had been in the period from May to the end of November, because of the slowdown in military operations caused by, no doubt, a multiplicity of factors. The Russian army no longer needed to fire as many shells as it previously did. Also, if the Russians are preparing for a further offensive this year, were preparing for a further offensive this year, as they almost certainly are, then it is likely that they would have wanted to stockpile shells to prepare for that offensive. So that could mean that at some point in the next few weeks and months, as the Russian offensive gets back under speed, we will start to see shell use by the Russians increase again to 40,000 a day. Well, at any rate, that is Syrskyi's figure. Now, Simplicius the Thinker says that Syrskyi had said during the interview that Ukraine is now firing half the number of shells that Russia is firing by comparison with the number of shells that it had been firing earlier in 2024, when the rate of difference was basically 10 to 1. Now that would mean, now that is not actually what Syrski himself said. It was an interview, it was his interviewer who gave those ratios, 10 to 1 last year, 2 to 1 now. Now, 10 to 1 last year would imply that throughout last year, Ukraine was down to firing around 4,000 shells. So the Russians were firing 40,000 shells, the Ukrainians were firing 4,000 shells. Now, if the number of shells the Ukrainians are now firing is half the number that the Russians are firing or were firing, which was 23,000, then that would suggest that Ukraine's own rate of use of shells increased or has increased to around 10,000 a day. Now that is not impossible, and it would be consistent with this rush of supplies to Ukraine, which was made by the Biden administration in the autumn of 2024, and also the delivery of large quantities of shells from former Syrian army stockpiles sent to Ukraine via Turkey. So, nonetheless, and in spite of all of that, the Russians, according to Syrski's claims, still manage to maintain a large superiority over Ukraine in shell use. It was perhaps 2 to 1 in February, March. It's now increased again to 3 to 1. If shell use increases to 4 to 1, to 40,000 again on the part of the Russians in the summer, then it'll be 4 to 1, always assuming that the Ukrainians are able to maintain the firing rate at the same level of 10,000 a day. I am going to suggest that that is extremely unlikely, unless the United States sends Ukraine more shells, probably the stockpile of shells supplied by the United States in the autumn will start to run down in the summer. And I have obviously no idea what the quantity of shells supplied from Syrian army stocks was, but I'm going to guess that that will probably, at this rate of use, also probably start to decline at some point over the next few months. In which case, we could again start to see a very lopsided picture in terms of artillery and shell use in this war. Now, I say all of this because I'm going to suggest that one of the reasons for all those big Russian breakthroughs last summer was precisely because the Russians were able to put down so much more artillery on Ukrainian positions, so much more artillery on Ukrainian positions than the Ukrainians were able to do on Russian positions. The Russians were able to bring down shells in vast numbers on the Ukrainians, and they were able to supplement them with drones and with fab bombs and all of those things. The level of firepower available to the Russians last year obviously was lopsidedly and massively in their favor. Just saying. Now, Syrski also has a number of other very interesting points to make. Firstly, he is very angry with the article in the New York Times describing the strong relationship, the level of the relationship between the United States and Ukraine, and setting out in such detail the way in which it was the United States essentially that ran and operated the war. Now, he is angry not because he denies the quality or the level of that partnership described in the New York Times article. On the contrary, he appears to confirm it. What makes him angry are the personal criticisms of him made in that New York Times article. He denies, for example, that he had as many troops fighting in Bakhmut as the New York Times claims. He says that he read comments in the New York Times article attributed to him, which he never made, and he's clearly furious about it. But anyway, overall, he nonetheless appears to acknowledge the underlying truth of that article, which is that up to the time of the end of the Biden administration, it was the United States that was basically running the war. He also acknowledges that Russia has enormous untapped mobilization reserves. He says that the number of people, men, that Russia could in theory call up who have actual military training and who could be committed to the conflict numbers 5 million. I don't for one moment believe that anybody in Russia has plans to enlist that number of men and to bring them into the war. But he contrasts that enormous mobilization reserve with the very inadequate one that Ukraine has, which my sense is, from reading his article, he knows is basically exhausted. So, given that this is an attrition war, I would have thought that the time has come to acknowledge that attrition is now running its course and that Ukraine is effectively, in effect, on the brink of losing that attrition. But of course, he doesn't say that, and that nowhere appears in the article. He also makes an interesting admission about drones. He says that Ukrainian technology is far superior to Russian technology. He provides no examples of this. He then admits that it's only in the next couple of weeks that the Ukrainians will finally achieve parity with the Russians in terms of fiber optic guided drones. The Russians started to use fiber optic drones on a large scale, I think it was about 6 months ago, and it has taken the Ukrainians a long time finally to get on top of this technology. And there was an article in the Financial Times which I think shows why. Russian drone production is industrial. It takes place in big factories. It uses skilled workers. It is organized in an industrial manner, whereas Ukrainian drone production is fragmented. It is carried out, according to the Financial Times, in around 500 different workshops scattered across Ukraine, which suggests an essentially artisanal approach to production. Now, that, by definition, limits capacity. It means that in the end, Ukraine will not be able to keep up with the Russians, who are producing drones on an industrial basis. And in fact, the word I have heard is that we've already long passed the point when the Russians overtook the Ukrainians in drone production, and that they currently outproduce the Ukrainians in drones by a factor of 5 to 1, 5 million to 1 million. But the reality also is that if you have a fragmented industry, it is much, much more difficult to introduce industrial and technological innovations than it is if you're conducting production on an industrial scale. Again, this is an area where I have experience, but a small workshop may struggle to get on top of a sophisticated new technology like fiber optic drones, whereas a large factory, provided it has reliable supplies, can develop the mechanisms to do that on a very rapid and continuous basis. And contrary to what Sirski says, I'm going to suggest that Russian drone technology will steadily surpass Ukrainian over the course of the year, of the coming year. And I'm also going to suggest that it is precisely this very fragmented quality of Ukrainian drone production which explains why they fell so far behind the Russians in utilizing and producing fiber optic drones. So that's another thing I wanted to say. Lastly, Sirski also gave some interesting pieces of history. He gave an entirely new justification of the Kursk operation of August 2024, the Ukrainian offensive into Kursk region. He said that the situation on the northern front lines was critical, that the Russians had advanced into Kharkiv, that they were in the process of preparing a huge offensive in the north, in Chasiv Yar, in Toretsk, in Kupiansk, in all of these places, and that the Ukrainian offensive into Kursk region was intended to preempt it, and that it did indeed successfully disrupt the Russian plans for this great northern offensive that the Russians had been planning to launch. Now, Zelensky has given many explanations for the Kursk offensive of August 2024, but I don't recall this one as being one of those explanations. This is a new explanation that Sirski has given, and I have to say that I don't place any weight on it whatsoever. I recall the events of 2024 very well. The major thrust of the Russians was towards the Dnieper, westwards from Avdiivka. That went entirely unimpeded by the operation in Kursk region. And the whole idea that the Russians were in the process of preparing this vast, enormous general offensive in the north of Ukraine in the spring and early summer of 2024, as far as I'm concerned, has no evidential foundation behind it. So I don't take this particular claim seriously. The Ukrainians have never settled on a single cogent explanation why the Kursk operation took place. The reason is that they are unable to straightforwardly say what the actual reason for the Kursk offensive was, which was to seize the Kursk nuclear power plant. I've said this many times. I'm not going to repeat myself here endlessly, but because they can't admit to the true reason, the true purpose of that operation, they have to come up with different explanations all the time, none of which in and of itself makes any sense. Now, the last thing that Sirski said, which I did find interesting, and this is from a historical point of view, which was that the first assaults that the Russians made around Kiev in February 2022, the very first days of the special military operation, involved a force of just 9 battalions. That would be between, maybe 5,000 to 10,000 men in total, probably closer to 5,000 men than 10,000 men. And as Sirski correctly points out, it's impossible to encircle or capture a huge city like Kiev with just 5 to 10,000 men. I mean, it just made no sense. And he suggests that the real plan that the Russians had at that time was not to try to capture Kiev, not to conduct a military operation at all, but to send a force quickly into Kiev, seize the central area, the government area of the city, before a defense had been properly organized, capture the political and military leadership of the country, and basically, as a result of that kind of coup de main, end the war immediately, and on that basis. Now, on that, actually, he may be right. What he is describing is an operation very similar to the one that the Soviets conducted in Prague in 1968, when they did exactly that. They seized a local airport near Prague, in fact, Prague Airport, and they, with a special forces unit, they then advanced deep into Prague during the night against confused and scattered resistance, hardly any resistance, in fact. They were able to arrest all of the leading figures of the Czech government. They brought them to Moscow. There was a negotiation in Moscow, as a result of which Czechoslovakia had to agree to the Soviet terms, which were basically dictated to them by the Soviet leadership. It's an extraordinary operation. It was an extraordinary operation, one which, as a military operation, was actually quite spectacular. And the Russians, the Soviets, repeated it again with a high measure of success about a decade later, when they did essentially the same thing in Kabul in 1979, when again a special forces unit captured Kabul airport in Afghanistan and rushed to the presidential palace with orders to execute the Afghan president Hafizullah Amin, which orders were successfully carried out. So it's not impossible that some person in the Russian military, some Russian official, maybe Putin himself, thought that they could try to do the same thing in Kiev in 2022. And one could see the attraction if Zelensky and the other political leaders had all been arrested and brought to Moscow, then it might indeed have been possible to basically coerce these people into agreeing to a peace very much on Russian terms. However, the operation obviously failed. And by the way, I should say, I remember that in 2022, in February 2022, a Russian motorized column did actually penetrate quite deeply into Kiev, and it might have been tasked with carrying out an operation like that, though it was quickly withdrawn. Anyway, if that was the plan, it basically went wrong almost immediately, and it's not difficult to see why. Firstly, Kiev, in terms of its area, is a far bigger place than Prague, which I know quite well, by the way, and Kabul, which I've never visited, but which I know a little bit about its geography. Also, the Ukrainian leadership at that time was far better informed about what the Russians were preparing and might be intending to do than the governments of Czechoslovakia in 1968 and Afghanistan in 1979 were. They were getting a stream of intelligence from the United States, and the element of surprise, which would have been crucial to an operation of this kind, simply wasn't there. So it's unsurprising that this operation failed, though maybe it was worth a try, and that might have been the calculation in Moscow. Anyway, put that aside, Syrskyi says that the current Russian military, which he puts at 624,000 in Ukraine now is 5 times bigger than the force that Russia sent into Ukraine in February 2022. And that gives us, again, a number of around 150,000 for the size of the Russian force that entered Ukraine in February 2022. And to say it simply, that force is nowhere near, would have been nowhere near big enough to occupy the whole of Ukraine against resistance. Anyway, this is an interesting interview from Syrski. Clearly, he's looking into the future, and the future is not bright. He admits that American military supplies are winding down. He continues to hope that he will get more from the Europeans, but he can't really have many expectations of that. He's relying, as the Ukrainians tend to do at the moment, overmuch on drones. He is discounting the effect of artillery, though I have no doubt that Russian superiority in artillery was critical to the success of Russia's offensives last year. And he also acknowledges a manpower crisis, even at the same time as he knows that the Russians have no problems in manpower, not whatsoever. He also clearly has no expectation that the Russians are anywhere close to running out of steam. To repeat again, when he was asked directly how long he thought the Russians would be able to sustain an offensive, he avoided giving an answer. So that's Syrski. Now, let's go to the military situation. As I said, I'm going to discuss it fairly briefly, but we'll talk about it quickly on the basis of what we've learned from Syrski. It's absolutely clear to me that we are indeed at the early stages of a Russian offensive in Ukraine. This is now becoming the mainstream view, and I've no doubt it is true. I think I'm right in saying that I was the first person to suggest it. The Russians are clearly focused, however, on multiple areas at the same time, and this makes it very difficult to give a single overview of where events are moving. This is a great difference from the situation earlier in the war. The contact line is enormously long, 1,000 plus kilometers long. Previously, at earlier stages in the war, I remember that battles used to happen in one place, and we used to talk about them, and everywhere else things would be quiet. So, for example, in the summer of 2022, the Russians first captured Mariupol, then they switched focus to Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, then the Ukrainians struck in Kharkiv, and then they struck, or at least then they pressed their offensive in Kherson region. Then, over the course of 2023, we had first the fighting in Bakhmut, which basically was the only area where large-scale fighting was taking place in the first half of 2023. And then the second part of 2023 was taken up by the Ukrainian offensive, which was basically focused on two areas. One, Zaporozhye region, the attempt to try to break through to the Black Sea, and the other, General Syrski's offensive to try to recapture Bakhmut. So that was 2023. Then the Russian offensive that followed that offensive focused on Avdiivka. Then Avdiivka was captured, and then, as I said a moment ago, the main focus of the Russian advance in the spring, summer, autumn of 2024 was west of Avdiivka, towards Pokrovsk and towards the Dnieper, and ultimately towards Zaporozhye as well. The Russians did launch two secondary offensives, one in Kharkiv, but with a relatively small force of about 50,000 men, and the other in Toretsk, where the fighting was clearly given less energy than in the other two places, Toretsk and Chasiv Yar. The main focus of the Russians, as I said, was in the south, towards the Dnieper, advancing west from Avdiivka. That is not the case with the offensive that we're looking at now, and it's very difficult at the moment to get an accurate sense of where the heaviest punch from the Russians is going to come. So firstly, in Sumy region, which borders Kursk, the Russians have been busy capturing more and more territory, lots of villages. They've also pushed, or appear to have pushed, the Ukrainians out of Belgorod region. Even the Ukrainians now acknowledge that the Russians are in full control of the two border villages of Popovka and Demidovka. And, well, there are suggestions that the Russians are trying to conduct some kind of encirclement operation of the Ukrainian forces that remain in northern Sumy region, close to the Russian border, fighting for the villages of Athleisure and Gornyak, and that the fighting, but also in northern Sumy region as well, with the Russians perhaps having some kind of plan once they've captured all of these positions to move further towards the city of Sumy itself. It's possible. Then we have this incredibly complicated war that's been fought for a long time now on the Oskol and Zherebets rivers. And here we have a very, very large Russian bridgehead now established north of Kupiansk and west of the Oskol River, on the Ukrainian side of the Oskol River. Now, there have been more reports over the last couple of hours of the Russians capturing significant more territory there, enlarging and joining up the various bridgeheads. There's been reports of villages captured. I'm not going to discuss that in detail, though the fighting in the village of Kamienka, which many see as the key here, continues. The most important thing to say about this particular area, the northern Kupiansk area, west of the Oskol River, is that the Russians are now deploying armoured vehicles, heavy armoured vehicles, and artillery west of the Oskol River. Up to now, the Russian troops, who presumably crossed the Oskol River in boats or light pontoon bridges, or perhaps in some places even waded across, though that might be difficult to do in the winter. The Russian troops west of the Oskol River have been infantry. But now the bridgehead is obviously broad enough that stronger bridges have been constructed, and also the bridges have now connected with Russian territory, and we are starting to see armoured vehicles appear, including TOS-1 tanks, the ones that launch these enormously powerful thermobaric munitions. It's a devastating weapon. And as I said before, long tanks, armoured vehicles, in ever greater number, all the forces, in other words, that you would need to conduct an offensive. So an important change is taking place in this area. Now, this is, of course, in Kharkiv region, and we've had lots of reports that the Russians, having basically completed the capture of Volchansk north of the Volcha River, have now crossed the Volcha River and are operating in significant areas of southern Volchansk and look to be very close to capturing the whole of Volchansk, not just the north of Volchansk, which is the main area of Volchansk, but all of the area of Volchansk, the remaining suburbs of Volchansk, south of the Volcha River. It's been suggested that despite the fact that the distance between the bridgeheads, the Russian bridgehead, west of the Oskol River and Volchansk itself is quite extensive, that the Russians ultimately intend to link up their forces in Volchansk with their forces west of the Oskol River. Complicated operation, and I'm not sure how it can be carried out and when it will be carried out, but then who knows? Maybe it can be, and I don't know how strong the Ukrainian troops are in this area. Anyway, that's one area where the Russians are heavily focused. Then there's the other southern end of the Oskol and Zherebets rivers. Now, the Russians have basically encircled the Ukrainian troops, or at least taken the Ukrainian troops, the remaining Ukrainian troops who are located on the east bank of the Zherebets River, into some kind of a semicircle. But they've also established a sizable bridgehead west of the Zherebets River as well. And the apparent objectives are firstly to cut off supplies to Siversk, this town, fortified town in a long salient north of Bakhmut and Solidar, west of Severodonetsk, place which the Russians have tried to capture many times, but which they've never managed to capture up to now. In order to cut off supplies to Seversk, they need to capture the small town of Torsk, and there are now photos apparently which show Russian troops certainly on the northern outskirts of this place. Perhaps they are in full control of it, and the village of Yampol immediately to the south. But it could also be that the Russians are planning to capture the important town of Liman, which lies a short distance west of the Zherebets River, and which would be an important objective for the Russians. Firstly, it would bring them much closer to Slavyansk, and it would also further undermine the potential defenses of Siversk. And again, over the last 24 hours, there have been multiple reports of further significant Russian advances in this area, and in particular of a critical situation for the Ukrainian group that's still located on the east bank, which appears to be semi-surrounded and at risk of complete encirclement. And that grouping includes troops from the 3rd Azov Brigade, which is absolutely considered an elite unit. Anyway, that's one very complicated operation. Then there's another complex operation underway, which is the one that's currently underway in the Chasov Yar, Toretsk, Konstantinovka area. Now, yesterday I spoke about a daring raid that the Russians have made north of Toretsk. They seem to have sent an armoured column north. I thought this was a raid rather than an actual sustained attack, but it seems that the Russians have in fact managed to dig in a village north of Toretsk, some distance north of Toretsk, called Filipovka. Now, this is unusual because Filipovka appears to be well in advance of the Russian positions. And the force that now operates, that's now occupying Filipovka, looks very much, I would have said, in danger of encirclement. That suggests that there are follow-up Russian troops intending to move up the same road to link up with this advanced party, which has occupied Filipovka. There is a coal mine. We have lots of coal mines in this area, between, or at least on the west side of the road, which the Russians have been using to reach Filipovka. It's assumed that there are Ukrainian troops there. Probably there's a fierce battle underway for control of this coal mine. If the Russians capture it, then they have effectively achieved a major breakthrough against Ukrainian defenses. And there have been more reports that the Russians have been pushing forward in the various villages west of Donetsk. They seem to be clearing up all of these villages. And as I discussed in my program yesterday, it looks as if they're preparing for a major offensive west from Chasiv Yar. There are still Ukrainian troops from the 24th Mechanized Brigade, apparently, defending themselves in the high-rise building area in Chasiv Yar, but their supplies are becoming increasingly tenuous. There were complaints from Ukrainian commentators that their position is becoming extremely difficult. So it looks as if a big operation is underway in this area, presumably to capture all the ground south of Konstantinovka and to begin an offensive, maybe in midsummer, to capture that particular town. And then there's Pokrovsk. The Russians have established themselves positions north of the Pokrovsk-Konstantinovka highway. They have also apparently seen off the various Ukrainian counterattacks close to Pokrovsk. They have Pokrovsk in a semicircle, and reports say that they have expanded their control in the area just to southwest of Pokrovsk. It looks as if a blow against Pokrovsk might be coming as well. And lastly, there are the continued Russian advances in southwest Donbass and in Zaporozhye region, where the Russians seem to be very busy destroying Ukrainian vehicles and supplies, and interrupting supplies and using their drones in doing so. So you could see that in every part of the front lines, the Russians are advancing. There is no area which is quiet. And that must be putting the Ukrainians under incredible stress. Their forces are having to defend everywhere at once, and that must be exhausting their reserves. It is not surprising that General Syrski is complaining about the fact that he doesn't have enough men being mobilized. He's coming up with proposals for the total digitalization of the Ukrainian population in order to make mobilization more effective, and why he complains that the Russian army is getting bigger and bigger and bigger all the time. He worries that by the end of the year, the Russian army will have increased by another 120,000 men. Just saying. And of course, it is not just the situation on the ground, but the situation in the skies that must be worrying General Syrski, because with every single day, in fact, there were more cases of this last night, there are Russian drone attacks on Ukrainian cities, Russian missile attacks on Ukrainian cities. There was an attack with apparently Iskander-M missiles on Dnipro, the city of Dnipro, which I've seen pictures of an enormous cloud, explosive cloud from one particular facility that was hit by this missile. And of course, that goes on every day, all the time. And last but not least, this perhaps isn't something that General Syrski himself is thinking much about. But financial aid from the West is shrinking. The United States is no longer providing funding at the level that it previously did. There was a lot of talk a few weeks and months ago about Ukraine being provided with a big loan. The European Union said that it had provided extra money, but the Ukrainians are saying that they've not seen any of this. The IMF is talking about providing further assistance. But Ukraine is now running very, very large budget deficit, which it previously covered through Western aid. That deficit, it seems, is no longer being covered. The currency is apparently starting to weaken. Inflation across Ukraine is rising, with the government no longer able to cover its own expenses. We are again looking at a potential hyperinflationary crisis by the end of this year, unless something is done quickly to prevent that happening and to bring this deteriorating economic situation under control. And if you spend time going through the Telegram channels, if you read comments that Ukrainians have been making, you will find that these economic pressures are very much at the forefront of their concerns, and some officials within Ukraine seem to be talking in the same way about that as well. And, well, what is President Zelensky's own way to get out of these problems? Well, his officials, Yermak, for example, after a brief flurry of discussions that were taking place a short time ago about possible elections in Ukraine this late spring, summer, he's now said that that is a nonsense idea and it won't happen. So elections have again been ruled out. Zelensky has again said that Ukraine needs more and more weapons. He's given him more interviews to this effect. He sent his officials to another meeting of the EU in Brussels. There's been so many meetings by the Europeans about Ukraine. Anyway, Zelensky has sent more of his officials there. He says that the fact that the Russians are preparing and working towards launching this great offensive is a sign that they're not really interested in peace. There's no evidence that the Russians are actually interested in peace. What Ukraine must therefore receive is more weapons, more funding. Zelensky has even said that what Ukraine needs is predictable, reliable, unlimited funding. If that is provided, then all supposedly will be well. Without it, however, he doesn't actually say this, but without it, presumably, Ukraine's situation would be grave. As for a diplomatic initiative, as for Zelensky showing any willingness to bend on any of his positions, for example, showing some acceptance of the need to cede territory to the Russians. I don't mean just accept that the Russians occupy that territory and will do so for a certain period of time, but an acceptance that some of this territory is irretrievably lost. As for Zelensky, accepting that Ukraine will never be able to join NATO, those kind of things. Well, Zelensky has nothing to say about that at all. He rejects these ideas outright. He continues to insist that Ukraine is entitled to join whichever alliance and economic system it chooses. It is entitled to have all its territory returned to it. He continues to insist on his objectives, his goals, which, to say it frankly, he's never wavered from since he first set them out in his so-called peace plan in the autumn of 2022. So there's no real sign of Ukraine, of the Ukrainian leadership, responding or adjusting its stance in response to this deteriorating situation. Zelensky's idea continues to be that Ukraine must be assisted to fight on, because that way, eventually, at some point in time, the Russians will come to understand that they can never gain victory in Ukraine, and they will capitulate and come to terms on the basis of Zelensky's demands. Again, the position he has taken, well, basically since the failure of the 2023 summer counteroffensive, and he has never shifted from it. Now, what are the Europeans doing? Well, it may surprise you to learn, it won't surprise you to learn, that we have had another meeting run basically by Macron and Starmer, and yet another meeting of the coalition of the willing. Now, I've spoken about Starmer's monomaniac fixation with Ukraine, even as the economic situation in Britain deteriorates fast. But I'm going to suggest this is becoming dangerous for Britain itself. In fact, it is dangerous for Britain itself. And one can see more and more concerns being expressed about this. And apparently there are rumblings now within the Labour Party, the government party, about the fact that the Prime Minister seems to be more concerned with Ukraine. He appears to love another country and care about another country, Ukraine, more than his own. Anyway, there's been another meeting of the coalition, the chiefs, the various military people who went to Ukraine have apparently come back and reported. It's not clear exactly what they did report, but we've had a long article about this in the Daily Telegraph. They've apparently suggested that a small force can go to Ukraine, and its job would be to rebuild and train the Ukrainian army in conditions of a ceasefire so that it could withstand the Russians when the Russians eventually choose to go back on the offensive again. And that would be a 5-year mission, supposedly, to bring the Ukrainians back to that level where they can withstand the Russians. Now, here we are entering into the world of complete make-believe, because there's been no shortage of training of Ukrainian troops by Western advisors since the start of the special military operation and before. The Ukrainians have been grumbling and complaining about the quality of the training that they have been provided. And of course, in reality, we're not just talking about training to bring the Ukrainian forces back up to the level that they were in, say, on the eve of the summer 2023 counteroffensive, would require an enormous commitment of resources by the Western powers, by the European powers, because the Americans are making it quite clear that they're washing their hands of the whole affair. So the Europeans would have to step up arms production. They would have to supply all these arms to Ukraine, primarily to Ukraine. They'd have to rebuild the Ukrainian Air Force from scratch, presumably with European fighter jets. They'd have to rebuild the Ukrainian army again, all over again, with new tanks and new armoured vehicles. It is all completely unrealistic. There's actually been a German team that has returned from Ukraine to Germany, and they're saying that much of the equipment that's been supplied to Ukraine by the Western powers doesn't work. The Leopard 2, when it breaks down, there is really no ability to repair it in the field. By the way, I've seen photos of abandoned Leopard 2s, what look like intact Leopard 2s, left behind by the Ukrainian army in Kursk region. The Russians have now got complete Leopard 2s, and no doubt are testing them and developing counters to them, just saying. Anyway, so Leopard 2, fragile and difficult to operate. The Leopard 1, because of its thin armour and its light gun, unsuitable for use as a tank. It can only be used as self-propelled artillery, exactly as Brian Beletic predicted, just saying. The German self-propelled howitzers that were provided to Ukraine, susceptible to constant breakdowns and unsuitable for field conditions in Ukraine. The Iris-T system that the Germans provide, effective up to a point, but the missiles are too expensive, and Ukraine has too few of them to make a significant difference. By the way, it's a very, very long time since I've heard Ukraine make any claims about shooting down any Russian aircraft, just saying. And the Patriot system that Germany donated, apparently old, susceptible to breakdown as well, and not very effective either. In fact, Ukraine's air defense system seems to have effectively broken down, and of the F-16s, we hear little or nothing. But nonetheless, Europeans are going to spend the next 5 years, supposedly, in Ukraine, rebuilding the Ukrainian army back up to that kind of level, with tanks and armoured vehicles which don't exist at horrendous cost. And of course, as to the Russians, well, the Russians apparently are going to simply sit back with their arms folded and are going to do nothing. Because apparently the French team told the various European leaders there's absolutely nothing to worry about. If the Russians are taking so long to capture territory in Ukraine before the Western troops come, well, they are unlikely to risk getting into a fight with the Western troops, the Europeans, the French and the British, because obviously the British and the French are so much better than the Ukrainians that even though they will be there in minuscule numbers, they'll be able to take on the Russian army by themselves with the Ukrainians alongside, and the Russians will not dare fight against them. It is absolute fantasy, but you can find that very thing set out in the Daily Telegraph. That very comment from the French set out in the Daily Telegraph, that the Russians are going to be intimidated, afraid of the presence of the British and the French troops, and for that reason they won't want to take them on in battle. Now, as I said, all of this is completely unrealistic, and apparently most of the countries that attended this meeting actually were pretty forthright and said so. It seems that the so-called coalition of the willing has now dwindled to 6 states. Britain and France, a third country, which may be Denmark, probably is, and the 3 Baltic states. No one else wants to become involved. Even Sweden, which is very, very hostile to Russia and has just provided Ukraine with another big weapons and support package. Anyway, they've said that they regard all of this as unwise and premature. Nonetheless, it looks as if Starmer and Macron are not going to give up. They're going to go on pressing with this terrible idea, and they're doing it, in my opinion, mostly because, well, partly because they genuinely do want to prevent any kind of peace agreement between in Ukraine of the sort that the Americans and the Russians might agree with each other. Now, over the last few hours, in fact, just before I started making this program, reports suddenly appeared that Stephen Witkoff, Donald Trump's envoy, is back in Russia. He is meeting with Kirill Dmitriev, the head of the Russian Investment Fund, in St. Petersburg. He will then be traveling to Moscow, where he will have a further meeting with Putin. Peskov, Putin's spokesman, is saying that the purpose of the meeting from the Russian point of view will be for Putin to explain to Witkoff Russia's concerns. And I suspect that those concerns will mostly be about Ukraine's egregious and undeniable violations of the energy truce. In fact, from what I can tell, the Ukrainians have, if anything, stepped up their attack on the Russian energy system during the time frame of the energy truce. The Russians are going to complain about that, and they're going to tell the Witkoff, look, we said that the Ukrainians cannot be trusted, and here you have the proof. I understand there's been comments from Russian officials that the Trump administration has come to understand Zelensky's extreme, visceral hatred of Russians, which obviously isn't confined to Zelensky himself. And I've no doubt that that's something else which Putin will bring up in the meeting with Witkoff. Now, this whole dialogue between the United States and Russia is very difficult at some levels to understand. We seem to be as far from a ceasefire as ever. There don't seem to be proper discussions about the substantive issues, what the Russians call the root causes of the war. There's been a good article in Responsible Statecraft by Anatol Levin, which says that in order for there to be peace, there have to be discussions about the root causes of the war. The idea of having a ceasefire and then waiting, getting a ceasefire, and then discussing the root causes of the war, all that is going to do, given the attitudes that certainly the Ukrainians have, their unwillingness to make any substantive concessions whatsoever. All that will happen is that the negotiations will be spun out indefinitely, and we will end up with another frozen conflict, which the Russians have correctly said is completely unacceptable for them. So, I'm sure Putin is also going to say that to Witkoff. Putin is also going to point out to Witkoff that there are no political figures in Kiev who are going to take substantially different positions from the ones that Zelensky has taken. Now, I say that, again, we've had comments to this effect from Russian officials over the last 24 hours. I would quickly add that Yulia Tymoshenko has now proposed the Korean variant as the solution to the conflict, a situation where the Russians retain what they have, but Ukraine doesn't recognize it. Ukraine is free, whatever is left of Ukraine is free to make whatever alliances or commitments it chooses. It rebuilds its own armed forces. There are demilitarized zones and that kind of thing. Now, that might be proposals that are attractive to some in the West, but the Russians will not accept them. And if that is as far as Tymoshenko is prepared to go, we are no further forward than we would be with Zelensky. And as I said, I think the Russians are going to point that out to Witkoff as well. And they're going to say to Witkoff this: if you really want to move forward with peace, it has to be negotiated directly between Russia and the United States. The Ukrainians are never going to agree to a peace in that form. And ultimately, what has to happen is that the United States and Russia must together dictate terms to the Europeans and to Ukraine. The Europeans have no interest in peace. Starmer's and Macron's obsessive talk about sending European troops into Ukraine confirms it, and the rhetoric and the actions coming from Kiev show the same thing. So either we have that agreement, either we have that negotiation, or we continue with this offensive that we have just begun. And we are confident, the Russians are confident, that that offensive will be successful because all of the facts point to it being so. And then maybe in the autumn we can come back and look at this whole situation again. But by that point, the dynamic will have radically changed, and it will be Ukraine and the Western powers which will be in a much weaker position than the one in which they're in now. Now, all of this is being said by the Russians to a government in Washington which is completely absorbed by the tariff crisis. Now, here I'm going to finish this program by discussing some information I've received from a certain source, who's been reliable in the past, and which, by the way, I think probably is true, but which provides a particular Russian take about the tariff crisis, which is both interesting and disturbing. Now, this again focuses on discussions that have been taking place in the Russian parliament, the Duma, and these are comments, these are opinions which appear to be shared by a number of people within the Duma, but which center on one particular political figure there. I am not going to name him because, again, doing so might affect the position of the source. But anyway, this particular individual, this MP, is someone who is known to me, by the way, who has an interesting background extending back to the Brezhnev era, and who has always struck me as being quite influential and very well connected indeed. Anyway, this person's view and that of various others in the Duma and in the wider political class is that the latest things that we have been seeing coming out of Washington in the last few weeks are not just a recalibration of American economic policy, adopting tariffs and such things. Rather, they are a kind of stress test on the American economy, a dress rehearsal, if you prefer, for a situation in which the American economy has to find itself or finds itself in an all-out military conflict with a superpower adversary. In other words, it's intended to see what parts of the economy might buckle under the stress, where the difficulties would be, in order to take preparatory measures to prepare to fix those problems in advance of that conflict which is to come. Now, spoken in that way, discussed in that way, it's not difficult to see what sort of conflict that would be a preparation for. I presume it would be a conflict with China. So, a dress rehearsal, if you like, for a kind of war economy in the United States ahead of a conflict in the Asia-Pacific region with China, perhaps a conflict not just with China, but with the Eurasian powers altogether, with Russia as well. Now, I want to stress, I am not suggesting that this is a widespread view in the Kremlin, and I should also make clear that it is not, in fact, my view either. I don't believe that this is what lies behind Donald Trump's motivations in making these steps towards tariffs that he has made. On the contrary, I'm quite convinced that they are focused on his project to regenerate American industry and American business in the way that I've discussed in previous programs. And for the record, I doubt that the people in the Kremlin share these views. But I suspect that these views are now quite common in Russia, that there is a concern that the United States is in effect preparing for war presumably with China, and that that Russia itself needs to sort itself out in light of these events which are coming. Well, apparently the view in the Duma is that whether that is the case or not, the fact that these possibilities exist make it even more important to get the military offensive in Ukraine underway and successfully underway, and that Russia must be on its guard for these events because wider conflict is there over the horizon. I would say that the Russian mood at the moment is pretty implacable, as I think Mr. Witkoff is going to discover when he arrives and meets with President Putin, which I expect will be later today. Anyway, I will discuss more of that tomorrow. There'll be an awful lot more, I'm sure, spoken about. I would say that Mr. Witkoff seems to be very busy because he's apparently expected to be in Oman tomorrow, where he's involved in the discussions with the Iranians. He's been asked to do too much in too many places, in my opinion. But anyway, that is the end of my program today. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget also to check out our shop. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.